November 16, 1957. Frank Warden pushes open the door to his mother's hardware store in Plainfield, Wisconsin. The bell tinkles. The counter is where it always is, but something is wrong. Blood, a trail he doesn't understand. The cash register gone. There is a receipt folded on the floor with a name written on it, Ed Gein. He calls the sheriff. The town, a handful of blocks and a few farms, exhales a last small private breath before the world begins to arrive in the form of reporters, photographers, and a story that will outlive the quiet it ripped open. This is still unanswered. I'm Mara Ellison. Tonight, the butcher of Plainfield, Edward Gein, not as a creature to gawk at, but as a person whose life, choices, and pathology force us to ask difficult questions about responsibility, community, and the stories we choose to tell.
Mara, thanks. It's hard to listen to that cold open and not feel the weight. The case of Ed Gein is one of those moments in American criminology where fact and myth, they sort of spiral into each other. The image people carry, lampshades, masks, a woman suit, those images are real, yes, but they've also been amplified by culture. We need to hold both, the documented and the way the story took on a life.
Right. We'll be careful. Tonight, I want to keep returning to what is still unanswered. How many people did Ed Gein actually kill? Was he a serial killer by definition, or something else? And what happens to a town like Plainfield when it becomes shorthand for a kind of American horror? Kelvin, before we get into those questions, can you give listeners the baseline? Who was Edward Gein in the facts?
Sure. Edward Theodore Gein was born August 27, 1906, in La Crosse County, Wisconsin. He grew up on a farm near Plainfield. His father, George, struggled with alcoholism and was described as weak. His mother, Augusta, was domineering and intensely religious. She preached about sin, especially the sin of women. Ed had one brother, Henry. The family was isolated. Augusta discouraged friendships, kept the boys at home, read them the Bible, especially passages about punishment and evil. That isolation and the family dynamics are key to understanding his later life, though they don't explain it.
I always think about the house, Augusta boarding up rooms, keeping them like shrines. It's an image that haunts. Preserved mother, preserved authority. Ed was 39 when his mother died in 1945. Biographers point to her death as a psychological pivot. He boarded her room up and started living in smaller, filthy parts of the house. That's when the nocturnal cemetery visits reportedly begin.
Yes. In his confessions and later psychiatric interviews, Gein described entering a sort of trance and going to cemeteries, Plainfield, Hancock, Spiritland, often after reading obituaries for women who reminded him of his mother. Between roughly 1947 and 1957, he admitted to about 40 cemetery visits. He said that in half of them he took nothing. In the others, he exhumed bodies or body parts, which he brought home.
And the scale of what investigators found in 1957 is what pushed his name into national headlines. They found human skin fashioned into household items, lampshades, chairs, a wastebasket, masks made from faces, a corset, leggings, a belt of nipples. There were skulls as bowls, organs in pans. I don't want to linger on enumeration for shock's sake, but we also can't ignore the damage done to bodies and to families. Calvin, clinically, how do you parse the behavior of someone who treats corpses this way?
Clinically, we're in a mixed area. Necrophilia, fetishism, severe psychosis. Gein himself denied having intercourse with corpses. He said they smelled too bad, but admitted to deriving sexual gratification from handling and wearing body parts. Importantly, many experts argue he wasn't a classic serial killer who killed repeatedly for the thrill of the hunt. His activity seems centered on post-mortem use, exhuming corpses, dismembering them, preserving parts. That's crucial to the debate over labels.
And yet, murder did occur. 2 victims are confirmed: Mary Hogan, who disappeared in 1954, and Bernice Worden, whose disappearance in November 1957 led to the discovery. Let's talk through Mary first. Mary was a tavern owner, 51, known locally for being loud and earthy, someone Augusta would have called sinful. Her tavern was found with blood and a bullet casing. Her body was missing until investigators later found her skull and a mask made of her skin at Gein's farm.
Gein later admitted shooting Mary in the head with a .32 caliber and removing her body. Why did he escalate here? It's not entirely clear, but many clinicians suspect Mary represented something in his conflicted view of women, someone who embodied the sinfulness his mother railed against, yet whose body was also desirable to him as a material to possess or become.
And then Bernice Worden. That's the case that brought him in that November. A register receipt for a gallon of antifreeze, Ed Gein's name on it, places him at the store that day. Frank Worden finds blood, the register missing. Gein is arrested later that evening. In a shed, investigators find Bernice's body, hanging by her ankles, headless, and gruesomely mutilated. She'd been shot and then gutted. Gein claimed once that the rifle accidentally went off while he admired it, but the premeditation is hard to reconcile with that claim.
Exactly. The antifreeze purchase is particularly important as evidence of planning. It's one of those small, banal documents that say a great deal about intent. When someone prepares, when they bring an item tied to the crime scene, it suggests volition, even if the person later claims accident. That's part of why the legal outcome in the 1960s is complex. Guilty of first-degree murder, but then not guilty by reason of insanity. He was returned to institutional custody.
We'll come back to the insanity verdict, but before that, Mara interrupts herself. Kelvin, can I ask you about the 40 cemetery visits he admitted to? Investigators exhumed at least 9-10 disturbed graves. Does that square? Could he have done more than we know?
Forensic capabilities in the 1950s were limited. Exhumations can't always reconstruct everything. Coffins decayed, soil shifts, decomposition. Gein's statement about 40 visits, half abortive, fits with disturbing at least 9 graves. But it's plausible there were more bodies he disturbed or dismembered in ways that left no trace by the time investigators arrived. The truth is, we'll probably never know the full scope.
That unknown is one of the things that sticks with me. People want neat lists of victims and villains, but for so many families in small towns, the wound was private and persistent. Plainfield had about 800 residents at the time. Many knew the victims. Many knew the murderer. The arrival of reporters and curiosity, the sensational headlines, locals were furious and embarrassed. One resident later said of a book that revisited the case, "Whoever wrote that book should be shot." They'd already been shot by publicity, not bullets.
There's something to be said about the community trauma. When a town is associated with an atrocity, it affects identity. Some attempted to erase the physical reminder. The farmhouse burned down in March 1958, just days before it was to be auctioned. Many locals believe it was arson, a communal choice to destroy the site of horror. That kind of vigilant erasure is an emotional reaction, understandable, but it also destroys material evidence.
The farmhouse itself. Officers who entered were traumatized. Sheriff Art Schley later assaulted Gein in interrogation. That assault invalidated an early confession. Schley's mental decline afterward became part of the story. Locals said he was haunted by what he saw and by what he'd done. It's an ugly cycle. The crime traumatizes, the trauma begets actions that produce more harm. Calvin, when you evaluate Gein's psychiatric profile, what stands out?
Several things. First, chronic psychosis with hallucinatory experiences. He reported conversations with his dead mother, commands, and beliefs that he could raise the dead. Second, severe personality disturbance combined with fetishistic necrophilic behavior. Psychiatrists diagnosed him with schizophrenia or mixed-type psychosis. Under the legal standards of the time, and often today, such intense detachment from reality can support an insanity defense, because the person may not understand the wrongfulness of their acts. But it's never that simple. He clearly engaged in concealment, planning, and purposeful acts, which complicates any moral absolution.
And that's the messy heart of tonight's episode. The tension between illness and responsibility. Listeners, we'll unpack the trial more in a bit. First, I want to pull back to early life. How much of Gein is product of upbringing, and how much is something else? Augusta has become a figure in the myth, woman of rigid religion, abusive, who told the boys the world was full of sin. I've read sources that call her fanatically religious, verbally abusive toward George, shunning her son's friendships, especially with women. Where does that leave us as analysts?
We can't reduce violent pathology to a single cause. Early attachment patterns matter. Being raised in an environment where the primary caregiver instills fear and condemnation can distort one's views on gender and relationships. Augusta seems to have been both object of worship and source of terror for Ed. That ambivalence, worship/hatred, houses what psychologists call an ambivalent attachment. After her death, Ed's attempts to recreate or become her, through preserved rooms and later the woman suit, suggest deep identity disturbance tied to that relationship.
And yet, we must be careful. Not everyone who grew up in a cold or abusive household became a murderer. We must resist deterministic narratives. There are other towns where women preached strict religion, where men drank, where kids were bullied. Something about the combination with psychosis, perhaps genetic vulnerability, created this particular pathway.
Absolutely. We have to think in terms of risk factors, not causes. Genetics, early trauma, social isolation, repeated reinforcement of particular beliefs, and perhaps neurological factors create a probability, not a destiny. Also, we should remember Ed's brother Henry's death in 1944. The official cause was asphyxiation during a burn, but there were bruises on his head. No autopsy. Ed led the search party and may have lied earlier about Henry's whereabouts. It raises questions we still can't answer.
Which is another of our central unanswereds. Did Ed kill Henry? Investigators never charged him. The 1940s investigation was limited. Without modern forensics and a good autopsy, questions remain. Calvin, you mentioned the psychiatric evaluations. After his arrest, he was declared incompetent and committed to Central State Hospital for the criminally insane. He spent years in institutional custody. Then, in 1968, doctors declared him competent for trial. The judge's ruling, guilty, then immediately not guilty by reason of insanity, is perplexing for some listeners. Could you unpack why that happened?
Sure. Competency to stand trial is about whether a defendant can understand court proceedings and assist in their defense. Insanity at the time of the crime is a separate question about the mental state when the offense occurred, whether they understood right from wrong. After years in hospital, clinicians thought Gein could participate meaningfully in his defense. That's competency. But psychiatric testimony convinced Judge Golmar that at the time of Bernice Worden's murder, Gein's psychosis rendered him legally insane. Hence the finding, guilty of first-degree murder, then not guilty by reason of insanity. The effect? Life in institutional care rather than prison.
The public often finds that unsatisfying. Someone accused of murder not going to prison in perpetuity. But, Calvin, in terms of public safety, does institutionalization differ materially from prison in those years?
Practically, for Gein, it meant he was removed from society and confined for life. He spent the rest of his life in psychiatric institutions, including Mendota Mental Health Institute, until his death in 1984. The difference legally is a recognition that his offense was a manifestation of severe mental illness and that treatment, not punishment, was the appropriate response. Whether that sits well with victims' families is another matter entirely. Many want retribution. Others want prevention. The law tries to balance culpability and public safety, but it's always imperfect.
I want to bring the victims back into this conversation. Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden. Their lives become footnotes in a horror narrative. Mary ran a tavern. Bernice ran a hardware store. Their families were left with ambiguity, grief, shame. Plainfield has tried to move on, yet dark tourism persists. People visit the cemetery, the site where the farmhouse once stood, even though nothing physical remains. There's a moral question here. Are we complicit when we turn this into entertainment? When we obsess over the mystery more than we remember the people who were taken?
We are complicit to varying degrees. True crime can be ethical if it centers victims and explores structural issues, mental health systems, forensic limits, community impact. But when it becomes spectacle, houses burned as attractions, a ghoul car shown at state fairs, that crosses a line. The line is between seeking understanding and satisfying morbid curiosity. Some of the post-1957 artifacts, like Gein's car being exhibited, felt exploitative.
Yes. The car was auctioned, shown at fairs. The farmhouse burned before it could be sold in an auction. Many suspect arson. The destruction of the house, was that community justice or arson? Who can answer that? It remains another thing we can't definitively know. And then there's the broader cultural impact. Gein's crimes influenced Norman Bates in Psycho, Leatherface in the Texas Chain Saw Massacre, and Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs. He's a template for horror. Why do you think that is, Calvin?
Gein touches on deep cultural taboos, the desecration of bodies, the assault on the maternal figure, the crossing of identity boundaries. Wearing someone else's skin is the ultimate symbolic invasion. These images are cinematic gold for horror writers. But the irony is that his actual confirmed murders, too, are fewer than many murderers we don't mythologize. What stuck is symbolic violence, violating the dead, the sanctity of the grave, and of the mother figure. Those images resonate because they're visceral and archetypal.
Listeners, pause for a moment and think about that distinction. Symbol versus scale. It's not the body count alone that made Gein a cultural monster. It's the way his crimes struck at our cultural assumptions about death, decency, and the mother-child bond. Now, Calvin, I want to press you on the diagnosis. Some modern commentators have suggested links to gender dysphoria or to identity disorder, given the woman suit and the attempt to become his mother. What's your take?
We need to be cautious. Retrospective diagnosis is hazardous. The woman suit can be read multiple ways, as a macabre attempt to become or resurrect Augusta, as an expression of fetishistic desire, or as part of a psychotic ritual. Linking it wholesale to contemporary understandings of gender dysphoria is problematic because gender dysphoria itself is not inherently violent or associated with criminality. Gein's actions are better understood through the lens of psychosis combined with necrophilia and an identity disturbance rooted in pathological fixation with his mother.
So, not a neat modern label. Another, still unanswered. How many victims did he really have? Confirmed? 2. Suspected? Possibly up to 7 more, and a questionable death of his brother Henry. Forensic tools in the 1950s were rudimentary, no DNA, limited osteological matching. If we had modern forensics, would we know more?
Almost certainly. DNA testing could match small fragments to families. Isotopic and osteological analysis might indicate origins of remains. But the problem is also the passage of time. Remains were sometimes burned, moved, or in a condition that makes modern testing difficult. So, while modern forensics would have likely clarified many questions, some evidence was irretrievably altered or destroyed, either by the elements, by the burning of the farmhouse, or by decisions made in the immediate aftermath.
And then the legal choices. He was never tried for Mary Hogan's murder. There was no attempt to unpack every grave desecration legally, perhaps because authorities decided one verdict and indefinite institutionalization made further prosecutions redundant. But that legal economy leaves families without closure. And that non-prosecution played into the mystique. People began to add names to the list of victims, sometimes without evidence, simply because the image demanded a larger body count.
Yes, the narrative inflation, he must have killed many more, is a common feature in sensational cases. We should remember that abundance of grotesque items does not necessarily equate to a long list of homicides. Many of his activities were post-mortem. Still, the line is thin. Exhuming many bodies shows a repeated pattern of criminal behavior that inflicted harm, spiritual harm for families, legal harm in terms of property and bodily violation. That conduct is criminal even absent proof of homicide.
Let's pivot to the human side for a moment. After his commitment, sources describe Gein as a model patient, reading, doing crafts, polite, bland. He died in 1984 of lung cancer and heart failure in a hospital. He was buried in Plainfield Cemetery in the family plot. His gravestone was vandalized and later stolen and never returned. Now his grave is unmarked. There's a melancholy symmetry there. Buried, unremarked, but once he was a media obsession. How do we reconcile the man who sat quietly in a hospital with the mythic figure who inspired movies and shows?
We reconcile it by remembering humans are complex. A person can exhibit horrifying behaviors in one period of life and then live relatively placidly later, especially when removed from stressors and treated. Institutionalization can, in some cases, stabilize psychosis. But reconciliation doesn't mean absolution. It means holding contradictory truths together. The calm man in a hospital and the actor in catastrophic harm.
Listeners, We'll shift now into a segment that I often think about in this series: procedure and ethics. What did law enforcement miss? What did they do right? The initial interrogation saw officers overwhelmed. Sheriff Schley assaulting Gein produced a confession that had to be thrown out. That's misconduct. Yet the search produced undeniable evidence. From the procedural standpoint, what lessons were or should have been learned?
Several lessons. First, the importance of preserving evidence and avoiding contaminating crime scenes. Schley's assault undermined part of the process. Second, the need for early psychiatric assessment when suspects display signs of severe mental illness, not to excuse, but to protect the integrity of interrogation. Third, the need for forensic documentation, more thorough autopsies, better chain of custody for exhibits, and careful handling of remains that are sources of identification trauma for families. And finally, a lesson about media management. Small towns deserve protection from sensational press when managing investigations.
The media coverage was intense and, to many locals, exploitative. In the early 1980s, when Judge Gallmar published his book, Plainfield erupted again with anger. The town had spent years trying to live with the shadow. Renewed attention reopened wounds. That brings us to a modern question. As true crime producers, academics, and listeners, what's our responsibility? How do we investigate without exploiting?
We center victims and communities. We avoid gratuitous detail that serves only the shock economy. We contextualize, explain systemic failures in mental health, law enforcement, and social support. We speak to survivors and community members where possible, with sensitivity. And we resist the urge to mythologize. That doesn't mean we sanitize facts, but we tell them with purpose, to understand, to remember, to learn.
Those are sensible guardrails. Now, as we move into the final act of tonight's episode, I want to sit with the open questions and what they tell us about the American imagination. Why does Ed Gein continue to fascinate? Why does a rural Wisconsin farm from the 1950s still show up in Netflix anthologies and in international articles? Kelvin?
Because his crimes provoke fundamental fears, the violation of the corpse, the collapse of the family figure into something monstrous, the idea that the person next door can harbor an entirely different life hidden from view. Those themes are archetypal. They're also useful to storytellers who want to explore identity, community, and the grotesque. But the public fascination also reveals something darker. We prefer myth sometimes because myth makes terror digestible. Real life is messy and less narratively satisfying.
Real life is messy. Case in point, Henry's death, the uncertain number of graves, the burning farmhouse. Those ambiguities resist tidy answers. I want to close by asking you a blunt, clinical question, Calvin. If Gein were evaluated today, would our conclusion about insanity likely be the same? And what changes in modern psychiatry would alter his path?
Today, we have more nuanced understandings of psychotic disorders, better pharmacological treatments, and more robust community mental health resources when they're available. In Gein's case, if he had access to early treatment for psychosis, the trajectory might have been different. As for legal insanity, modern standards are similar, in that severe psychosis that impairs understanding of right and wrong can still justify an insanity verdict. I think it's likely he'd be found not criminally responsible by many courts, but each jurisdiction differs. Importantly, today's forensics would provide more clarity on victim counts and motivations, which would inform both the clinical and legal analyses.
So treatment availability,
Early intervention and better forensics could have changed outcomes, or at least our understanding. As we wrap, I want to return to our guiding question. What actually scares us more? The idea of a prolific serial killer or the lonely, broken man quietly building a world out of the dead? I think it's the latter, because that scenario is domesticated terror. Someone in a farmhouse, bland to neighbors, whose interior life is catastrophically disordered. Calvin, your closing thought.
I agree. The fear isn't always about numbers. It's about the ordinariness of the person who commits extraordinary violations. That ordinariness challenges our assumptions about who is dangerous and why. It's a reminder that public safety depends on systems, mental health, social services, vigilant but ethical law enforcement, not just on labeling one person a monster and walking away.
Tonight, two named women, Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden, lost their lives. Townspeople carried the label of Plainfield for decades. A house burned. A man was institutionalized and later buried without a marked stone. Images from that farmhouse fed decades of horror fiction. And yet, we still have unanswereds. How many graves were touched? Did Ed kill Henry? Who burned the house? What does justice mean for families who never saw a second trial? Those questions sit with us. They don't have satisfying endings. Before we end, Calvin, one quick rapid fire. What should listeners take away? One practical idea about how we approach cases like this as consumers of true crime.
Stay curious, but stay compassionate. Ask, who's missing from the narrative? Victims, families, the town. Demand sources, question sensationalism, and push for systems-level analysis rather than lurid detail. And support mental health services. That's practical, and in the long run, preventive.
Listeners, that's a good note to end on. I want to thank Dr. Calvin Rios for joining me tonight. Calvin, thank you for grounding this with clinical clarity and for holding the victims at the center.
Thank you, Mara. It's important work. Thank you for the sensitive framing.
If you've been affected by tonight's episode, reach out to a friend or a professional. If you want sources for any of the facts we discussed, they're in the episode notes. I encourage you to read widely: Britannica, archival material, and the original reporting when possible. Still Unanswered is a small operation. If you find value in what we do, consider supporting the podcast so we can continue to center the questions that matter. Finally, the final unanswered question of the night: which is worse, the man who murders many for sport, or the man who desecrates the dead for a private obsession? There's no correct answer. There's only the work of listening, remembering the victims, and demanding better systems in the future. I'm Mara Ellison. Good night.
Good night.